Pawanaka Podcast.
Welcome to the episode 2 of the Pawanka Podcast, a podcast where we explore the essence of indigenous peoples. For today's episode, our guest is Ruka Sombolingi. Ruka is the first woman Secretary General of the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, AMAN, the largest indigenous peoples organization worldwide, which has 1,025 indigenous communities and more than 30 indigenous organizations as members. Ruka belongs to the Toraja people of the central part of the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. We begin this conversation with Ruka by talking about the beginnings of AMAN, Aliansi Masyarakat Adat Nusantara.
The indigenous people's terms in Bahasa Indonesia, Indonesian language, we call it masyarakat adat. And I think it's important also how we can learn about how important the global solidarity is, how important the advocacy at international level is, and how this will and can influence our sisters and brothers across the globe. We might have only few people who go to the international level, but they're really setting the standards for us to, continue, carry on, and level up, provide leverage for all of us. So in early 90s, if you remember, so during that time we were under very oppressive regime, which is Suharto. It's a general, very militaristic, and there is no way you can talk about rights. The only umbrella, the only issues that can be used for indigenous peoples back then in the 80s and the early 90s is environment. So this can be the lesson learned for our sisters and brothers who are now under the very oppressive regime anywhere in the world today. So there's no way to talk about human rights. There's no way. It is only about community development, economic empowerment, and also about environment. So all the indigenous leaders who stand up back then, they always call themselves as the victim of development, the victim of mining, a victim of forest plantations, a victim of pollutions and all these things. But anytime when they were asked, why are you standing up? The one answers that they always provided is because this is our ancestral land. So that's the only thing they know, that this is our ancestral land. So in 1999, when Suharto stepped down, thanks to the student movement, we took the chance, and our leaders said, we also have to take part in the so-called reform era. It is the time for indigenous peoples to come out and say, hey, we are still around. We are not completely extinct. We are around, and in fact that probably most of the Indonesian territories were actually on our land. So, and we are around, and the constitutions recognize our what so called collective rights, our inherent rights as indigenous peoples, that we were already here before the state was established. So that's in 1999, and we also learn from I wouldn't say mistakes, but from the challenge that we have as indigenous peoples, where we have all these issues of how do we involve the women, how do we make sure that the young people will stay active, because sometimes in their community the young people will be called stupid or ignorance or whatsoever, without giving them chance to say and speak out what they want to say and what they feel and what they want with their life. In 1999, the presence of women were already very strong. Presence of women were already very strong. That's why from the beginning of Aman history, Aman was established, the proportion of women and men is already half-half, and it was reflected in the constitutions of Aman, that for national councils from each region it has to have one man and one woman. So we did, and this is because the women were organized. The women, as indigenous peoples, our rights will never come as if on the silver plate. People will never give up. The state, the company will always deny our rights. At internal level, us as indigenous peoples, as indigenous women, also facing the same thing. Our rights as indigenous women is not coming on the silver plate. We had to fight for that. So that's also happening with the indigenous women leaders who happened to attend the Congress back then. They were so strong, they were so organized. If the men are having, chill out in the evening with their male compatriot, the women never stop. The women, they gather like 24 hours a day to discuss about their agenda, what to strategize, what they want to do, and how to deal with all this, we have this what we call masculine or machismo cultures, right, within ourselves as a community, as indigenous people. So they had to, they didn't sleep. Any break time, they make use to meet. So that's why their voice was very strong. They were able to really go out and say, we don't want this, we want this. This is how we want things to be done. So that's why the influence of women in the very early establishment of Aman was very influential.
Let's listen to Ruka talk about Aman's values, the functioning of this organization, and the relevance of gender policies.
And I think that's also that helped the increased awareness of indigenous leaders in Aman to strengthen our governance, to be more inclusive to our own unfortunate element of our community, which is women and youth. Because we realize, although Aman is not traditional organizations. Aman is a modern organization that is composed, built, established by indigenous peoples with the some practices that we bring together from our our respective indigenous traditions and and communities. However, although we agree to hold some of the what we call universal value, which is democracy, respect for human rights, solidarity, we realize we are coming from different culture, which most of our cultures are still very biased against women and youth. That's why we need to put that in places, set of policy to remind us that we need to make sure that we include women and youth in every step of our decision-making processes and in every step of our work. When we talk about collective, it's not just the rights of the people who are alive now. Yeah, but we also talk about intergenerational collective. We don't talk about human as just human, but we are talking about other beings like animal, plants, even the spirits. Yeah, because the spiritual aspect of us as indigenous peoples, part of our existence, is very important. Because through the spiritual life of beings, we understand the connection with us and our ancestors, and our creators. So when we see indigenous peoples, indigenous community, you can imagine about a state, a country, yeah, a nation. That's why we call ourselves nations, yeah. Nations, not just communities, nations that cut across everything. And collective is very important because by keeping that collectives, yeah, you will be able to hold together every small individual things. If we look ourselves as indigenous peoples, we cannot see ourselves as the way modern perceptions about the existence or about the aspect of our life. The modern system, the modern way of thinking tends to put things in different boxes. That's why, including when we talk about human rights, they say political rights, yeah, economic rights, social, cultural rights. For us, all these rights are merging and connected together. And the heart of this is our governance system. And the governance systems, yeah, the governance of indigenous peoples will decide how do we exercise of what we call collective. Yeah, to decide, and that's where some people also call it rights to self-determination. It is also the right to self-determination. We have the right to determine what kind of life we want to live in, what kind of development we want to live in. Collective rights is protected through collective decision-making process only.
Let's continue listening to Ruka about the importance of indigenous peoples' governance systems, their right to autonomy, and to exercise their collective rights.
That's why the indigenous governance is very important, because indigenous governance will keep that collective rights as balancing act to individual rights. Keep things in order to make sure that people will not have war or fight between each other just because they said, I have the rights to farm. I have the rights to live. I have the right to build my house. Yeah, you have the rights. That's very true. But that's not necessarily. You can build your house everywhere. And I think it is just the same as a modern state, right? You can only build house on your land, which is proven it's your land. And it is just the same thing in our indigenous people's community. But people who are, already in this modern way of governance system won't be able to understand that clearly because they are operate, these two, the modern governance system and the indigenous governance system, they are operate in slightly different way. We don't have everything's written. We don't have punishment. We don't have, sometimes we don't have timelines. Yeah. When we do decision making process, we don't have you have 2 days to decide this. We don't. That's what we call also democracy. Deliberative democracy by deliberations. We discuss. And that's the different way of the modern nation state and indigenous governance system. We are a great challenge now, and our contributions as indigenous peoples has never been really counted on and put on paper as the real contributions for the human race, for the Mother Earth. But I think that's more and more, even now, evidence that the answer is in indigenous people's way of life. And I do believe, we can already start and talk about the new narrative and the new way of life.
We could listen to Ruka Sambalinji for hours and hours. This podcast appreciates all the knowledge shared with all listeners. We invite you to subscribe to the Pawanka Podcast on your favorite podcast platform.
Pawanka Podcast.